Alright, happy Monday to you. Hope everybody's had a good day today. I wanted to send out one more video on comparing fractions this time. Last time I talked about equivalent fractions. And today we're going over how to compare fractions. So there are three different strategies that I wanted to talk about. The first of which, when we're talking about comparing two or more fractions to each other, the first thing I like to do is to compare it to a landmark number. Earlier on in the year we started off comparing using whole numbers, comparing them to landmarks such as like 10 or multiples of 10 or 100 or 1000. And we can do the same thing here. So we're going to use the example of using 3/4 or 4/5, which is larger, those two. So if we want to compare it to 1/2, all right? Well, if we think of 3/4 fourths in terms of a half, 2/4 make 1/2. So 3/4 is larger than that. Now let's think about 4/5. What would 1/2 be in fifths? Well, 2/5 is the same, 2.5 fifths, if you think about it, is the same thing as 1/2. And so 4 is larger than that. So both 3/4 and 4/5 are larger than 1/2. So we're not able to answer the question of which is larger simply by comparing it to a half. So now let's think about another strategy. Since comparing it to a half didn't work, let's compare it and create a model to show it. All right, drawing a model is just like drawing a picture. Okay, so one thing that's very important if you're drawing a model to compare two or more fractions is that the whole that you draw is the same size for both fractions. If you were to have if you were trying to draw 1/2, if you were trying to compare 1/2 to 3/4, clearly 3/4 is larger than 1/2, but comparing these two wholes is not the same thing. It's hard to get an accurate comparison if you're comparing a circle, the whole of a circle, to the whole of a rectangle. So when you compare fractions together, it's super important to have the same size whole for each fraction that you compare. In addition to that, it's also extremely important that the pieces within the whole are all matching in size. They're all the same size. Okay? So I have drawn my model here. Top fraction represents 3/4, the bottom represents 4/5. And here we can get a pretty good idea based off of the pieces that I've drawn that 4/5 is going to be larger than 3/4. Some kids in class today had the idea that, and they noticed that both of these fractions are one piece away from making a complete whole, one away from making a complete whole. So what that means is, because fourths, there are fewer pieces, but each of the pieces is larger. Fifths, there are more pieces, each piece is smaller though. What that means is, the last missing piece with fourths, that one last piece, the space that's missing is larger than the space that's missing in the fifths. So that's saying that 4/5 has more taken up. There's less space remaining to be filled. More of it is filled, less is remaining, less is missing. Okay, so that tells us that 4/5 is larger. All right. Next, the final strategy here. If for some reason, and I've given a pretty good example down here, if for some reason your picture, you're not able to get the pieces the exact same size that they need to be, they're not completely accurate, and sometimes that's the case when we have especially fractions with larger denominators. I've given an example here of 2/5 and 3/8. So I've got 5 pieces up here and 8 pieces down here. All right. Now if you'll notice, my 3/8 is nearly matching up with the 2/5. I'm going to go ahead and tell you these two fractions are not equivalent to each other. But the picture that I've drawn is not drawn accurately. And so this poses a problem. Well, what if this happens when I'm drawing out a picture? Well, there's a way to get around that. is by finding common denominators. We want to come up with an equivalent fraction so that both of the denominators in each of the fractions are the same. It's much easier to compare fractions together when they have the same denominator, the same number of pieces, and all of the pieces are the same size. All right? So to do that, we've got to multiply the denominators together. So if we multiply 5 and 8 together, our common multiple, new denominator, we will have 40 pieces in our new whole. We'll make 40 pieces overall. All right, well, how do I get from 5 pieces to 40 pieces? Well, it's just like taking each fifth and cutting it into 8 more pieces. So it's like multiplying by 8. All right, so the same thing if we were just to focus on the shaded part. If each of these fifths were cut into 8 more pieces, there would be a total of 16 shaded pieces. So 2 fifths is the same thing as 16 40ths. Right? Well, now let's do the same thing for 3/8. How do we go from 8 pieces to 40 pieces? Well, it's like cutting each of our 8ths into 5 more pieces. Okay? So we're increasing the number 5 times, or by 5. All right? So now 8 times 5 makes 40. 3 times 5 makes 15. Now we can see which one of these is larger. All right, so in my picture over here, they look to be about the same size. Once we have now found equivalent fractions, both of them having the same denominator, it's clear that 2 fifths is just a slight bit larger than 3/8 by 1/40th. So which of these is larger? 2 fifths is. All right? So thinking in terms of finding an equivalent fraction using common denominators, that's another great way of figuring out which one is larger. All right? So 3 steps, comparing it to a half. If that does not work, if your 2 fractions, one of them is larger than a half, the other is less than a half, works great. If for some reason both of your fractions are more than 1/2 or less than 1/2, both of them, it's good to draw a model, picture. And then if the model doesn't line up, like it did in my example down here, finding common denominators. Okay? Usually finding common denominators, once you get the hang of it, it goes pretty quickly. You're able to visualize and do it mentally. So you choose whichever strategy works best for you. Of course, if this one doesn't work out, then you would want to move on to a different one. All right, I hope this helps. Use it in addition to your math journal and the study guide. And be prepared to ask me questions tomorrow. Thanks.